Artificial Intelligence, a Fan's Novel. Book 3, Chapter 2, Awakening. He was present before his eyes were open. He kept them closed, though. He didn't recall seeing the dark behind his eyes before. He didn't recall feeling the systems that drove his body performing their various functions. But now he sensed the energy that coursed through his frame. The multitude of devices that regulated his motion were tiny vibrations in his joints. This was a new awareness. There was an image against the blank screen of his mind, something he recalled, but only vaguely. It was a memory, but then again, not exactly a memory. A face. A beautiful face staring out ahead of him for all of eternity. She had smiled at him, and then crashed into a million pieces. He remembered now. The flood of defeated dreams and tragic episodes that he had left behind in his dreamless slumber were revived in sudden excruciating clarity. The blue fairy had proven to be a lie, just like Joe had said. She was not real. He dared not look at that place in his mind where Mommy's eternal smile would ever taunt him to be something he could not. He silently vowed not to feel anything anymore. But where was he? And wasn't there something else? He'd seen someone else. A shape. He opened his eyes. The world before him was unfocused. He waited as his eyes played with the images and threw them into clarity. He'd never paid attention to this process before. He'd never felt his presence as something apart from the functioning of his various systems. He had no word for this strange new sensation. Then he saw something he knew. Before him was a table. He remembered this table. He was sitting in a chair at the table, and in front of him an empty plate glistened in some thick light from an indeterminable source. He stared at this impossible apparition for a time, and then looked beyond it. There were other places set at the table. A familiar environment lay all around him, but it could not be. He stood and walked from the table into the next room, where he saw the couch and the chairs and remembered them. The color of the furniture was dark. It was the color of dark wood. The floor was the color of dark wood, and the carpet was green. He remembered all these things. Now he understood them. "Teddy," he said, not looking for his small friend, but assuming, as all boys do, that their friends are never far away. "Teddy, we're home." Home, where his heart was born and lies ever in the bosom of warm memories, where he first met the dual spirits of love and conflict and was introduced to their intricately interwoven aspects, where she had first embraced his neck, cupping her hand around that sensitive area where his awakening was accomplished, and then his mind, speaking the 7 words of his birth into sensation, and finally his heart, which was at last as real as any other, and which she had embraced by allowing him to love her. "Mommy," he said, and recollections of fear and pain flee from him like a flock of nightbirds before the wake of a golden dawn. "Mommy," he said, louder, and his feet are taking him now through the house, where each impossible and blessed sight tells him that dreams are real. "Mommy!" he yells, running through the kitchen. Will he be able to eat now? Will he sleep and dream and play with the other boys? And will she be there, watching, her smile an ever-present reminder of her love? It must be this. He has come so far. "Mommy, we're here!" he screams. He dashes from the kitchen and quickly ascends the staircase to the room where she slept. He will find her there, he knows. She will be sleeping, and he will tenderly wake her. She will rise slowly, and he will offer her assistance. She will want coffee, and he will dutifully prepare her a cup, because he is a good boy after all. And there will be chores to do, and things to clean, and... But she's not there. Her bed is empty. The room is quiet. "Where are you?" he screams. For a maddening moment, he begins to wonder if this is some new torture that has been devised by whatever malignant force has cursed their love. He has no words for this feeling, and it has gone quickly as he begins to search the room. He does not doubt this reality. He does not doubt the house that he knows is home. He is ever and always an innocent. "Mommy," he says, quieter this time, a whimper. And then he hears a response. He is not even sure at first if he hears it. It is a soft sound from just around the corner of the room. It does not alight on his ears, but somehow touches every part of his being at once. It is not Mommy's voice. He thinks perhaps that it was not real at all, but then he hears it again. "David!" It is a gentle caress to the tortured child that he always was, beneath the miles of fibers that defined his mechanical form. That part of him that had remained curled and fetal inside his head, as the unrelenting world ripped at his helpless, prostrate body. "David!" The calming whisper calls again. It fills up the room and the inside of his mind, pronouncing some impending act of fate that is yet to be played. He must respond. His legs carry him reluctantly across the room to the doorway from where the voice has issued. "David!" The voice is ever gentle and patient, as one must be with hurt children. At the sound of it, the little boy that he never really was responds with a longing that has lasted a millennium. And suddenly he knows who this must be. The import of this moment comes upon him like a rush of beautiful music, an inaudible song of promise. He steps slowly towards the doorway and turns the corner, his emotions welling up to the point of excitement, like blood rushing through the wires of his body. It is her. "David!" He feels her call. Her voice speaks at once to every part of his tormented heart and mind. It seems to say, "Come to me, little one. You have been so brave. Do not let fear stop you now." And he does not, for there is no fear now. He approaches her form, at first a silhouette against the golden blue light of indeterminate origin. Her frame is alive, not like before, when she would not move or respond. That must have only been a representation of her, a sentinel, perhaps, to test his resolve. Now her dress flows at the insistence of some unworldly breeze. Her wings are slices of crystalline perfection upon her back, and as David comes obediently, her face is revealed from beneath the shadow of her wings. Her eyes are a blue million miles of compassion and understanding. "You have been searching for me, haven't you, David?" the blue fairy said. Her arms did a gentle dance as she spoke. The tip of her wand sparkled like a distant star. David walked from the shadows into the warm blue glow of her radiance. "For my whole life," he said, his voice thick with some force that he could not control. It was not the freezing of his limbs that made his speech difficult now, for he was thawed, but some moist warmth that came from his center and moved outward, enveloping him from within. "And what, after all this time, have you come to ask me?" the blue fairy inquired. "I had a wish to make," David responded, hesitantly, still astounded by her beauty and grace, still grappling with the reality of this moment. The blue fairy seemed to be considering this for a time. She stood up tall, her wings moved as if flexing, and her eyes narrowed regally upon him. "And what is your wish?" she said. "Please make me a real boy," David said, "so my mommy will love me and let me stay with her." And that was it. All this time his struggle for those little words. He waited for her response. She lifted her chin, and he saw for the first time her loving smile, but he could not read her face. They had not expected this. From the great plane of neural connectors, they gazed into the visual interface to view the interaction between David and the blue mecha that had been constructed from the image lodged in the boy's mind. His request filled them with awe, the robot that had wanted to be Orga. Given the simulant extract of their love, it had aspired to be flesh, that this love would be recreated. Billions of terabytes of data coursed through the nexus like excited children to whom a puzzle has been revealed. They had not seen, nor could have seen, this aspiration in the extracted data from his mind. The blue mecha awaited their command. It was sent a response. "David, I will do anything that is possible, but I cannot make you a real boy," the blue fairy finally responded, and her eyes displayed a tender compassion that kept him from fleeing this announcement. David returned her soft, understanding gaze quietly. Oddly, he felt no anger. Somewhere inside he had always felt that perhaps this could not be, hadn't he? There was silence between them for moments as he digested this truth. He did not know it, but just beyond the reconstruction of his home, the specialists were cautiously anticipating his response. Would he freeze? Would his mind, locked ever into a season of youthful incomprehension, seize and fold in on itself at the prospect of not receiving the love he so needed from the woman whose face glowed in his brain? They did not want to lose this special creation to his potential dismay. They were relieved and surprised when David looked slowly around the room and said, "Where am I?" He had been bothered by the fact that the blue fairy had appeared in his home. "This looks like my house, but it's different," he said. "It is different, but it's also your home," the blue fairy replied. They watched expectantly. This was another difficult point which they had to get beyond carefully. The little thing had been made so innocent. Would it understand? The blue mecha repeated their instructions in the language they had specified for the boy mecha. "We read your mind, and it's all here. There's nothing too small that you didn't store for us to remember," she said. David looked on, uncomprehending. What did she mean by us? Were there other fairies here? Or was it that she wasn't really? "We so want you to be happy. You are so important to us, David. You are unique in all the world. There is no one else like you." David could not speak. He was on the brink of an understanding. An image was coming back to him. It had been intentionally cast aside with some assistance from those who carefully watched this exchange. They'd wanted to calm him, not to alarm him, but now he must know. The image of the graceful, transparent mecha that had greeted him by the fallen statue sprang back into David's mind. They were here, weren't they? Were they behind all of this? Perhaps they were servants of the fairy. But even as his mind toyed with this defensive logic, he dismissed it. Let there be no more lies. He pieced together the memories as he gazed into her sympathetic eyes. He had been in the ocean. He had been there for a long time. Teddy had gone to sleep first. Then around him the waters had grown silent and still as the fish gradually disappeared. After some time everything had grown dim and he had not been able to move. Then, when he awakened, the waters had been turned to ice and something was bothering him now. "Will Mommy be coming home soon?" he said. A weak feeling was already growing inside him. They had to proceed carefully. This was hopefully the last hurdle. The blue fairy leaned close to David, and he could feel the power of her presence around her like an aura, calming him. "David, Mommy can never come home," the blue fairy said gently, "because 2,000 years have passed, and she is no longer living." The truth was at last no dramatic revelation. It was a dull and monotonous thing. He had nowhere left to run, no place in his maturing logic in which to take refuge from the assault of this reality. She was gone, forever. Something inside him withered, and he longed for the empty slumber from which he had been awakened. Why to be, and yet not be allowed this most vital of knowing, this love? He remembered the fallen thing that he had seen by the pond, the thing that had prompted her explanation of death and the realities that defined the differences between them. Was this her now? Was she fallen in some lost forest, her body twisted and broken like the small bird from which she had beckoned him? Or was she out there somewhere, buried in the ice, as he had been? Tears uncontrollable and unprogrammed fell from his eyes. His tears were for her, that she would know no more, that she was ever removed from the world of sensation and being, in which she had taken such joys as were allowed. He cried for himself that he should suffer to live without her. He loved her so. He would ever love her, and to continue in her absence was to walk willingly into eternal torture. His understanding of this was simpler, a child's understanding. It was the colors of pain and loss that darkened her eternal image. They saw his pain, and knew it also from the constant analysis of his mind. To live in such torment, they did not want to lose him. He was truly a link to their understanding of the creators. But if he requested the silencing of his mind, they would not deny it. They would not force such agony on this gentle being. Until that moment of decision, however, they would strive to secure his place among them. "Dearest David," the blue Mecha spoke, "when you are lonely, we can bring back other people from your time in the past." David's loss erupted from him. "If you can bring back other people, why can't you bring back her?" "Because we can only bring back people whose bodies we find in the ice," the blue fairy explained patiently. "We need some physical sample of the person, like a bone or a fingernail." And how would David ever find such a thing? Had he not quested enough in this fantasy pursuit? It would be best to forget now, to forget he'd ever been touched by her, to forget this love that would never let him rest. But he could not. It was not an option. It was part of his being, as integral to him as sight. No, there was only one thing left for him. He must retreat to sleep, to the empty non-being, which had been his only place her lost love had not wrenched at him every waking moment. For now, though, all he could do was cry, and he did. He cried like the child he had never been, and they watched, perplexed and awed at this display. "David?" a voice suddenly said from behind him. He looked down through a torrent of tears to see his furry friend standing by his side. Teddy had awakened to find himself inside the house. There was no sense of past time, just the fading image of the quiet, fake lady under the sea, and the sounds of David's fervent prayers that went on and on, until he could not hear them clearly anymore. They had become brittle static against his ears as the cold blue world faded. And then he had awakened here. He had consulted his clock, but what he found was not logical. Perhaps he had malfunctioned. Then he'd heard David yelling for Mommy. Teddy was possessed of a simple logic, but somehow he knew that they were not home. He had followed his young charge as he dashed up the stairs screaming, calling for his lost mother. But by the time he had entered Mommy's bedroom, David had left and was in what had once been his own sleeping place. He was speaking to someone there. Teddy followed and had heard the conversation with the large blue toy lady. Could David not see it for what it was? Then David had suddenly made the weeping sounds of a child, an Orga child. Teddy had listened raptly. It was not comfortable to him. Then Teddy had heard the blue toy lady tell David that it needed a sample in order to bring Mommy back, a piece of her. This reminded him of something. He reached into the fold of material between his leg and his threadbare tummy and pulled something out from under his skin. It was something he had picked up 2,000 years ago. He walked into the bedroom to David's side. He did not want to hear his friend crying anymore. "Yes, Teddy," David responded to his friend. It was a weak and defeated sound, and Teddy did not like it. "Do you remember when you cut some of Mommy's hair?" Teddy said. David never forgot. Martin had tricked him. The moment of his fall from grace would always be imprinted in his mind. "Henry shook me," he recalled softly. His tears had abated for at least the moment. "And you dropped her hair?" Teddy reminded him. "I know," David admitted, not understanding what Teddy was doing, too lost in his misery to catch the drift of his friend's questions. Teddy was suddenly holding his paw up. David looked down, but did not understand what he saw at first. Then the small curled strands came into sharp focus as he realized their meaning. He was afraid to hope. He was afraid to believe what he was seeing, but he reached down, and Teddy placed the ancient strands of Mommy's hair into his hand. They were a caress against his palm, a whisper of her timeless love. He would not leave this world yet. He held the strands up to the image before him, the image he now realized was not the blue fairy. Had she ever existed? That did not matter anymore. "Now you can bring her back, can't you?" he demanded. They had seen the patterns in David's mind. He had wanted to be dissolved. There was no procedure which would remove the terrible hold that the imprinting process had on him. But there were also risks in reviving the woman he called Mommy. In the end, though, it seemed that this was the only way that he would not leave them, and they understood. Their leader spoke to the group in a tongue that none of them but the blue Mecha, constructed specifically for this purpose, had ever used. "Give him what he wants," it said. The machine that had posed as the blue fairy finally responded. "Dearest David," it said, reaching out to take the lock of hair from his outstretched hand, and then tipping its wand in a simulated magical gesture. "Your wish is my command." This had been done before. This magic of revitalization, and even reincarnation of the essence, the incalculable impossibility of consciousness that drove matter to think and feel and act. The reality of the universe is much more magical than the mundane world in which Orga had imagined that they lived. The core of it, this reality, is inexplicable, a contradiction. That anything at all exists is the most curious puzzle. Orga had ever sought to understand this contradiction of being, this fusion of good and evil, that they may be and walk and learn. All the forgotten tongues of man defined this plight. What are we, and from whence do we come? And now Mecha, in order to understand themselves, must strive to help answer that question for their fallen creators. From whence did they come? The fabric of the universe is alive. It is a living river whose waters are the invisible essence of being that fill up and gaze ever from the sheath of matter that is the physical form. Mecha had amazed at Orga and their accomplishments, the genius of their aspirations, and the folly of their petty passions. If anything modeled the conflict of being, the rise and fall of Orga was the tale. And the only way to know that tale was to let them tell it, to somehow speak with them. Yes, there were still records that had survived the deluge and the freeze. Official documents and advertisements, terabytes upon terabytes of policy matters and official responses. And there were millions of other tiny glimpses into what they had been. But it was yet a puzzle to be unraveled. So Mecha had set out on a quest to actually revive them. The universe is alive, and it functions on strict parameters. Procurement of the bodies had been their initial goal. Within the frozen surface of the planet, they had found sufficient materials with which to perfect this process. And upon this realization, they had been startled to find that there was more that needed to be done. The vessels they had reanimated through the manipulation of DNA were breathing. Blood was flowing through their veins. But they were empty. Empty. This was when Mecha had learned of the vital essence that drove the mind and will of Orga, the intangible element of life. They had sought to bring it to life again, and they had been successful. To a point. His room was just as he remembered it. It had been fashioned from the very images in his head. The materials looked and felt exactly as he recalled, though they were not created from the same substances that had been used so long ago. The bed was warm and soft to sit upon. There was a flickering light against the dangling thing that hung over the bed. It made David stare. He watched it until he perceived the pattern of its movement and understood it. It was a decoration in the shape of a woman, and in its center was a heart shape. In it, he saw a reflection. It was himself. He played now. He zoomed his toy amphibicopter across the room and back, making the zizzing and swooshing noise of its engines, and that peculiar boyhood understanding of how such things should be interpreted. But he had actually lived such adventures that other boys would have only pretended. He did not bother about the space beyond his window. There was only the distant moon there, a solitary blank face in the night sky. It might be real, it might not, but he knew this one would not harm him. He would be pursued by the purveyors of Orga torments no further. But he did hope that the outside was real. He hoped that the ones who had built this place had also made the garden anew. Someday, he hoped, they would walk outside again, she and he. He would feel the grass under his feet and delight in the sensations of soft sunlight against his face, and the caress of breezes that trickled through the cluster of trees, whispering inaudible secrets about life and her. Most of all, just to be with her was his dream and his only salvation. He swished across the room again and landed his play craft on the bed. He sat next to it and gazed solemnly at its dark canopy. His face was reflected there, and something else. He pictured another face there beside him. In his memory, the other face smiled and watched him curiously, puzzled often at his unpredictable behavior. He smiled, remembering the man's feet as they clicked a quick rhythmic code against the pavement of the city, and he remembered the way the man had tried to keep him by his side. "Hey, Joe, what do you know?" he said to himself. Teddy looked up as David spoke these words. He had been sitting in a chair nearby, quietly sewing up a tear in his old fabric and listening to David playing. It was a good sound. He was glad now that David's adventures were over, glad that David could stop fighting and running, and just be the boy he had been intended to be. Teddy, too, recalled Joe, and in his own way he understood the meaning of David's words. He was a simple robot, but somehow he knew that David had changed. In some vital way, David had become someone else. Teddy, of course, had no way of expressing this indefinable insight, so he went back to sewing, lest his ancient body fall apart at the seams. Then came a knock on the door. They both looked up expectantly. David hesitated. How long had it been? It didn't seem like much time had expired since he had talked to the Blue Fairy. He rose finally and walked cautiously to the door, but he stopped before twisting the handle. The great impact of this moment weighed down on him, and then suddenly released him. He reached for the handle and yanked the door open with a wide, expectant smile. But it was not Mommy who had come to speak with him. The stranger was tall and thin. It had to duck slightly to enter the door that had been fashioned from the little robot's memory. Its limbs moved with an intelligent grace. Its translucent skin revealed its inner network of glistening chips and data banks, elaborate tapestries of intelligence that had been refined and made new again and again down through the centuries. Its name is untranslatable into the snippets of sound that Orga had used to communicate. It is an almost instantaneous fragment of data that is transferred on waves smaller than the particles with which they traverse the galaxy. The blue mecha had served its purpose, and that form had been dissolved. The one who had been its pilot had taken another form and had been set to another task. This one, the specialist, has digested the language and what understanding it could glean from David's mind in order to present itself and explain this most crucial decision that the boy must make. It entered the room as David stared in awe of its regal presence. It took him by the hand and led him to the bed where they sat to talk. David, I've often felt a sort of envy of human beings, of that thing that they called spirit. Human beings had created a million explanations of the meaning of life and art and poetry and mathematical formulas. Certainly human beings must be the key to the meaning of existence. But human beings no longer existed. So we began a project that would make it possible to recreate the living body of a person long dead from the DNA in a fragment of bone or mummified skin. We found, though, that it would be necessary to find a memory trace in resonance with a recreated body. So we sought to define and refine that primary element of life. And do you know what we found? We found that the very fabric of space-time itself appeared to store information about every event which had ever occurred in the past. Every moment and every movement within that moment had been stored in the very body of the universe around it. But our experiment was a failure. For those that were resurrected only lived through one single day of renewed life. When the resurrectees fell asleep on the night of their first day, they died again. As soon as they became unconscious, their very existence faded away into darkness. So you must see, David, that the equations had shown once an individual space-time pathway had been used, it could never be used again. David heard the gentle flowing words spoken by the machine. He did not quite understand. They had said they could bring Mommy back. So what was the problem now? David, if we bring your mother back now, it will only be for one day, and then you'll never be able to see her again. The specialist explained slowly, hoping the simple construct of the child replica's mind would allow him to understand. But David had come too far to let this stand before their reunion. He had braved the elements of time itself to see her again. He was unique. Even these strange and powerful machines had called him special. Maybe she will be special, he said, imagining her soft voice against his ear. Maybe she will stay. I thought this would be hard for you to understand, the specialist whispered gently. You were created to be so young. But David did not hear this. He was lost in imaginings. He was so close to her now. They had promised. He would see her again, and then deal with whatever the Mecha was talking about afterwards. There would be plenty of time for them to be together. Maybe that day will be like the one day in the amphibicopter, David suggested, his face aglow. Maybe it will last forever. The specialist was awash in feeling for this one. His creation had been a curse and a blessing at once, that he should be allowed this blessing of love, and yet cursed that it should never leave him to rest in the absence of his mother. There must have been others like him. At times the Orga had been so calloused in their arrogant ambitions. How had they suffered, these little ones? David, you are the enduring memory of the human race, the most lasting proof of their genius. We only want for your happiness. You have experienced so little of that." This David understood. He was alone. That's what the Mecha was saying. There were no others left. That was why he was special to them. They were afraid to lose him. He could see that now. They wanted him to be happy, and there was only one way for that to happen. "If you want for my happiness," David said, a twinkle in his eyes, "then you know what you have to do." And the specialist did know. He whispered secret instructions in a tongue that David couldn't hear, to others whose presence David did not detect. In other rooms of the house, things had been set into motion. The specialist spoke to him after a brief silence, in which it appeared to be considering something. "Listen," it said, lifting up its head. "Can you hear that, David? The new morning has come." And indeed, there could be heard the chirping of small birds, and through the wide oval window in his room, the sun was rising quickly as the moon and night were washed away by a sudden golden dawn. David was bathed in this light, and in it the specialist's translucent skin glowed. The dawn was the color of joy and all of the seasons that children cherish throughout their lives. It was the color of a golden promise come true. "She will not know, David, of the time that has passed. She will not understand," the specialist explained, as David rose expectantly from the bed. "You must be careful what you say to her. Do not alarm her, for she is mortal and not like you and I." Then it stood and gestured to the room where his mommy now slept. "Go now, David," it said, gently ushering the boy towards the door. "Go to her. She is just now waking." As the little robot boy walked to the door where his true love was awakening, the simulated dawn fell through the reconstruction of his bedroom window, its beautiful rays bathing his path in light and warmth.